Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Let me just mention to everyone here, I'm sure that you, of course, are seeing the news this morning. And, South Lake Tahoe is in our hearts and in our thoughts this morning. And we hope that everything goes as well as it can, that people are safe, their homes are safe. Many of us, of course, have, I'm sure, family memories and a fondness, not only for the area, but of course, for the community itself is important. And also, of course, the natural ecosystem that we hope will survive and remain going forward. So South Lake Tahoe and everyone up in the Sierras right now battling this fire, and the firefighters are in our thoughts. So we're going to go ahead and start. The webinar is, as you all know, California's Changing Electorate, Implications for the Recall and Beyond. It's hosted by the USC Center for Inclusive Democracy, as well as the USC Price School of Public Policy. So we are also joined by two distinguished panelists, Rosalind Gold, the Chief Public Policy Officer for NALEO Educational Fund, and Jonathan Methestein, Executive Director for California Common Cause. Now, we will hear from both of them a little later in the panel portion of our morning, and we will give them, of course, proper introductions at that time, but I just want to welcome them. Thank you both for joining us. So we do have a very tight agenda, 45 minutes. We're going to get you the highlights of the newly released research study, have I think, a good, robust conversation. And the last 5 minutes of our time, we will leave open for just kind of any burning questions, and then we'll call it at about 10:45. So we will move fast. I want everyone to know that we will be sending out a thank you note to everyone that will include a recording of this video, so you can watch it again, you can share it, as well as a link to the report itself. So with that said, I would like to also thank USC Price School, Katie and her team for putting together the webinar, and of course my own team at the Center for Inclusive Democracy for all their hard work on this study. And we are excited to finally get it out to everyone and hope that the data are useful and informative going forward. So our webinar this morning is based on a report called the 2020 Post-Election Analysis of Voting Behavior. It is a 2020 general election statewide study. And there's really several components to this study. First, though, I want to acknowledge the context, right, of the general election, really the most unique election, I think, by far, by any standard, in California and across the country. So many different variables at play, but really what we're focused on today, of course, is the fact that election officers were trying to put on an election during a pandemic, and voters were needing to have their voice heard, and do it safely, right, during a public health crisis. And so in our state, it meant that there were lots of different options available to voters. I won't get into this slide here because of time, but just to emphasize, we had counties that were newly implementing the Voters' Choice Act, including Los Angeles County. Counties that had consolidated polling places with countywide voting, more with traditional polling places as well, and then also counties that stayed with their traditional polling place model. But the one thing that every county had in common is that at a state level, every registered voter, I should say, was mailed a vote-by-mail ballot, and they had options for turning in that ballot, mailing it, of course, dropping it off at a drop box, dropping it off at a voting location, as well as still, of course, in-person voting and being able to access all of the services at an in-person location. Now, the number of drop boxes varied significantly across the county, but there were a number of options that were new for many, many voters in California. And we're going to try to understand some of that voting behavior. The big question, of course, is, would all those options, how would that make a difference in terms of how people actually voted? Would it change their behavior? And then going forward, what can we expect? Will some of those changes stay? How will that influence voters potentially in future elections? So there are a number of components to this report. I just want to emphasize that this is a first in a series of reports under this larger umbrella study. Today's report, as you access it, you will see that we are, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about each of these, four main topics. So voting methods in the 2020 general election, vote by mail ballot rejection rates and reasons for those rejections. We have data on both components, voter information sources, and their preferences and how and where to vote in future elections. So we'll cover some highlights of each of those areas. And our report was, and the whole study was generously supported by the Evelyn and Walter Haas Junior Fund. Just a quick note about methodology. I want to make sure that we do touch on that as researchers. There were four topics, but three main buckets in terms of data collection, three types of sources and approaches in this very large study. So one was looking at voting behavior using the voter file, California voter file, a deep dive into that. Then also a California voter experience survey, actually the third one that we've conducted in the last few years. And then not part of the report that we're talking about today, but talking about a future report in this series. We conduct focus groups, specifically with Black, Indigenous, and formerly incarcerated populations. That work will be published later this fall. And we'll give a voice to populations that are often difficult to identify in a voter file analysis, for instance. Okay, so voting behavior. Today, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about method of voting, rejection rates, ballot rejections. Want everyone to know that even though I'm just giving a highlight today in the report, we do look at these data by multiple groups. So race, ethnicity, age, gender, previous polling place voters, new voters, foreign born, and of course, political party affiliation. And the geographies, even though today I'm just going to stick to statewide, we have data available by county as well as LA County, which of course is a quarter of the state's registered voter population. A note though on race ethnicity, which I think is very important, and we detail this significantly in the methodology section of the report. So I welcome you to take a look at that if you're interested. But for the voter file analysis, not the survey, but for the voter file analysis, this information here that I have on the screen, we're only able to identify Latinos and Asian Americans at a reliable rate in terms of accuracy for research purposes. We're not able to identify Black voters or other subgroups, and certainly don't want to put forward data that could potentially be, of course, inaccurate, all right, that is unreliable. So questions, happy to take those in the Q&A, but again, we detail that in the report. Okay, jumping in because of time, let's talk about voting methods. So again, this is a deep dive in the voter file. So we know over the last 2 decades, California has increased significantly in the use of vote by mail, and we saw a big jump in the 2020 general election. So again, everybody got mailed a vote by mail ballot. We already talked about that. But 87% of all ballots cast were vote by mail ballots. That was up more than 20 percentage points from the 2018 general election. And in-person voting, either at a voting center or a polling place, dropped to just under 13%, down from 30%. We typically see about 30-35% of all ballots cast in recent years being in person. And so that changed significantly. But there's more to that story. So now for today's purposes, we're just going to look at all of these charts that I'm going to show you just at the California level because of time. So just look at that top row. And you can see that in person, that blue box there at 12.6%. What's interesting here is I said 87% of all ballots cast were vote by mail, right? Well, actually, only 33, about a third of all ballots cast were actually sent through the mail. That's that green box. Another 38%, right, the most numerous, were dropped off at a drop box, and then another 16% were dropped off at a voting location. This drop box is a significant increase from what we've seen in previous years, just really an explosion of the use of drop boxes in California. I want to note, though, that for Latino voters, youth voters, new voters, previous polling place voters, they voted in person at higher rates, still lower numbers than vote by mail, but they voted in person at higher rates compared to the general population. And this is consistent with our previous research over the last decade, always seeing these groups as having higher rates of in-person voting. Asian American voters, also consistent with previous research, cast ballots in person at lower rates compared to Latinos and youth. And just to quickly show you what that looks like, I know this is a busy screen. Again, we're just going to look at the California row, if you're with me. Up at the top, there's that 12.6%. We're just going to look at the blue in California. All voters, 12.6%. Latinos, 15.9%. So higher, right? Almost 16% of all ballots, Latino ballots cast, were in person. And then 8.7% for Asian American there on the right in that top row. And then for new voters, again, we'll look at that top row, California. 21% of all new ballots cast by new voters were in person, so much higher than the state average. And then if we look at previous voting method, why are we looking at this? Because of course, a lot of questions about how would people who have previously voted recently at a polling place or vote center, how would they take to using vote by mail, right? What would that look like? And we saw here that, again, if you look at the left here, that California row, that blue box, nearly a quarter of voters who were previous polling place or vote center voters voted in person. Okay, and then only 4.6% of previous vote by mail voters. So for time, then we're going to move on. So rejections, just a few slides here. So a small proportion of California ballots are rejected in elections, every election. Always at, but a big but, always at disproportionate rates in certain voter populations. So the rejection rate for California, based on our data, was 0.5%. That might not sound a whole lot, but that was a little over 80,000 ballots that were actually rejected. So still significant, right? Every ballot, every vote matters. If we move here, and I'm not going to show you slides because of time, but I just want to show you a couple of texts, just a bit of information to make sure everybody has it. Rejection rates varied by county, and that data, again, is in the report. And they were higher amongst Latino, Asian American youth, previous polling place voters, and new voters. And the highest, I think, one of the highest, at least for race ethnicity, was for Latinos. So voting behavior, rejection reasons. So ballots get rejected. Why do they get rejected? Well, historically, this is also consistent with some of our previous research and others, late ballots are historically the most common reason for vote by mail ballot rejection across the state. But in 2020, in the general, in large part because of COVID, California election law changed. And instead of voters having to postmark it by election day and having just 3 days post-election to make sure that ballot gets to the elections office for it to be counted, an additional 2 weeks. So it was election day plus 17. So an additional 2 weeks were given to voters, a very wide window, right, for that ballot to make it and reach the elections office. And of course, that also was due to concerns around USPS reliability. However, in 2020, that changed significantly. The most common reason, so late ballots were much lower as a proportion, and instead signature issues were more common than late ballots in the 2020 general election. Just a quick slide here just to show, so rejection reasons for all voters, just to emphasize that red swath there, a signature doesn't match, right? Gold is no signature, and for California as a whole, 16% ballots rejected were rejected because they were too late. And Latino voters, young voters had lower rates of late ballots, higher rates of signature issues than the general population. And conversely, Asian American voters and foreign-born voters had higher rates of late vote by mail ballots than the general population. So we're going to move on to the survey here. We're going to go through this pretty quickly. So the survey was a very large sample size of over 11,000 representative sample by race, ethnicity, age, eligible voters with disabilities as well. The sample size was citizens of voting age, 18 plus. We conducted in English and Spanish, and large enough to give us a reliable sample for LA County. So we asked, did your county change the options for how and when you could cast your ballot in the November election? Purposely using that broader language because people don't, we found in previous research, people have a hard time articulating whether they have the Voters' Choice Act or what system they have, but have they heard in some way that there are changes about how they can vote? And 33% of our statewide survey respondents said they had heard. So really a low number, right? If you think about it in that sense, 33%. We asked, just moving on really quickly, how did you hear about the new voting options? And I should say here, of course, this varies by race, ethnicity, a little bit higher for Black voters, lower for Asian Americans, higher for non-Latino white. We asked, how did you hear about the new voting options in your county in November? And I've just got highlighted here to make it a little easier to find this because of time. But you can see the top reasons were media, newspapers, TV, kind of traditional media, social media next, if we look at the total row or column, and also friends and family. But if we look at friends and family, that does vary by race ethnicity. So Asian Americans saying much higher percentages, lower for Blacks, about the same for Latinos, a little bit lower for whites. And we see variation also in social media. And really all of these, and I welcome you again to look at those details that we can't provide today in a quick overview, but that are very important, especially for understanding the electorate and for targeting and outreach and voter education. How did you specifically learn about the in-person location where you voted or dropped off your vote by mail ballot? Here, overwhelmingly, and again, voters could pick multiple options. They're not supposed to add up to 100%, in case you're wondering. But overwhelmingly, they said official sources, right? County Voter Information Guide, the county website, vote by mail packet. Variation, whether by race or ethnicity, definitely variation by age as well, which I'm not showing you today. Variation by for those that have a disability status. But still, no matter what we look at, no matter how we break out the data by what type of subgroup, those are still the top 3 sources. It just the numbers change. Why did you vote in person at a voting location? Again, down here, I voted sticker. So 28% said to receive an I voted sticker. And that number was a little bit higher for Latinos, higher for Asian Americans, lower for non-Latino whites. Also, 20% said to be seen representing my community, right? Very important, and even higher for African Americans, for Black voters. And the highest percent, 28.7%, said they voted in person because they didn't trust the mail to deliver their vote by mail ballot. Why did you choose that specific in-person voting location? Highest by far was 54% close to home. Assigned a location also was big, convenient operating hours, but we also saw things like, it was close to work, 11%, close to home. Again, I welcome you to look at some of these details. How did you get to the in-person voting location where you dropped off your vote by mail ballot? Overwhelmingly, voters said they drove, but we still saw, and some variation by race, ethnicity, and by age and other statuses, but we saw people said they also walked and biked, got an Uber, public transit, paratransit, and so forth. So future elections. So 2 questions here. So we asked voters, thinking ahead to future elections, what would be your most preferred way to cast a ballot? And you can see here that about 2/3 of voters said some form of voting in person, but we gave them more than just voting in person on election day. So 23% said voting in person on election day. But others also said voting sometime in the 3 days before election day, or voting, the highest proportion here, voting sometime in the 10 days, voting early, right? And that's an option that's consistent with the Voters' Choice Act in California. This does not mean that people will be voting in person. This may be people's stated preferences, but reality gets in the way, right? They end up voting by mail. Maybe they always actually plan to vote by mail, but this is how they prefer, as stated. And lastly, in the future, what features would you be likely to use at an in-person voting location? And people said, of course, voting in person, dropping off their vote by mail ballot. But we also saw some significant numbers in terms of just using accessible voting machines, registering to vote, language assistance. Let me introduce Rosalind Gold here first. So Rosalind serves as Chief Public Policy Officer for NALEO Educational Fund, where she has worked for more than 3 decades on policy analysis and research for the organization's naturalization and Latino civic engagement efforts. Rosalind has extensive policy expertise in the areas of newcomer civic integration, election reform, voting rights, redistricting, and decennial census. Rosalind serves as the advisory committees and boards of several public affairs and research efforts, including Open Secrets, and she previously chaired the Board of Advisors of the Future of California Elections. She has delivered testimony before many public and private committee and commission hearings. And she received her JD from Harvard Law School and bachelor's from Pomona College in Claremont, California. Welcome, Rosalind. Thank you again very much for joining us. And then I'll move here just to also at the same time present to you Jonathan Methestein. So Jonathan is a civil rights attorney and longtime democracy reform advocate. Jonathan became the executive director of California Common Cause May 1st of 2020 after 10 years of being on the board of directors and 4 years as board chair. Jonathan previously spent 4 years as the head of the voting rights and census program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus, where he worked to increase access to California's democracy for historically disenfranchised communities, including immigrant and English-speaking voters, communities of color, limited English-speaking voters, communities of color, low-income communities, and people with disabilities. His work at AAAJ Asian Law Caucus included California's passage of the strongest state-level law in the nation, ensuring language access in voting, multiple appellate litigation wins that expanded access to democracy for voters of color, 5 poll monitoring programs, including the nation's largest in November of 2016, and several community organizing campaigns that won better election systems at the local level for historically disenfranchised communities. Welcome, both of you. Again, okay, so jumping into our questions as we go through our agenda fast and furiously. This is for both of you. I'll ask Rosalind to answer first. Actually, I'll ask, Jonathan to answer first. Please give us your thoughts, Jonathan, on the changes seen in voting behavior in 2020, including the increase in drop box voting and the reduction of in-person voting. Do you think the changes in voting behavior will continue in the recall and beyond?
Thanks, Mindy. Thank you for the invite, and thanks for the opportunity to comment on your really phenomenal study. It really moves our field forward every time you release a report. So I'm pleased to be here. I want to tackle your last question, which is what we saw in November 2020, just presaging what we're going to see in the recall and in future elections. And the Colorado experience, which adopted a version of the Voters' Choice Act many years ago and has been watching voter behavior change over time as voters become more comfortable with it. The Colorado experience might suggest, yes, the state has continually seen an increase in use of VBM and drop boxes to the point where in-person voting is now in single digits. In 2016, that's 5 years ago now, more than 94% of Colorado voters used their vote by mail ballot. And that would suggest that 2020 in California wasn't an aberration caused by the pandemic. It's just a step towards that Colorado future. But actually, I would suggest that there's a couple things that indicate we won't become Colorado. The first is that the Latino community in California is much larger and continues to prefer in-person voting. I'm sure Rosalind will speak to that in depth. We have LA County and to a lesser extent, Orange County, where there's just a culture of in-person voting that is ingrained and clearly resilient. From Mindy's data, we see that non-VCA counties in 2020 voted in person at 9.6%, and LA was over twice that. We also have a much higher need for language services that are available at in-person voting sites, right? So the new census data that was released this month indicates that California now has 15.6 million Latinos, 6 million Asian Americans. Previous surveys have shown that about 75% of both communities indicate that they speak a language other than English at home. About 1/3 of both communities indicate that they're limited English speaking. Colorado has 3.6 million registered voters total. California probably has that many limited English speaking voters, if not more. And that means that we're going to have an ongoing need for language access services that are available in person and that are going to, I think, put a cap to some extent on use of drop boxes, for example. And lastly, I want to sort of flag a different question, not whether or not we're going to continue to shift voter behavior, but whether shifting voter behavior results in a more representative electorate, right? So in California, we've done a lot of work to lower barriers to participation. We've created a flexible voting system that presumably at least is increasing. All those reforms are increasing voter registration in California and potentially increasing voter turnout. And yet we see really dramatic voter participation disparities on the basis of race and age that persist and don't seem to be getting much better. And the fact is that Colorado has the exact same dynamic. They have continuing voter participation disparities on the basis of race and age as well. And so it looks like the shift to a new election system is, to use a legal term or an LSAT term, necessary but not sufficient for building an electorate that actually looks like California. And that is the goal, at least for us, and I think for many civic engagement and civil rights organizations across California, is that increasing access is important, but creating a representative electorate is even more so. And there's more work to be done, clearly.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Rosalind?
Great. So good morning. I want to start by thanking Dr. Mindy Romero for the great research, thanking the Center for Inclusive Democracy and the Price Public Policy School. Again, I just want to echo my colleague's comments, Jonathan's comments about how excellent this research is. Just quickly, I did want to talk a little bit about our work at the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials Education Fund and what we've learned and how that aligns with this question that Dr. Romero has raised about what do these results show and what do they mean for the future. So at the NALEO Educational Fund, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We facilitate Latino participation in the American political process. A big component of our work is nonpartisan voter engagement that is specifically targeted to Latinos who are not yet fully engaged in the electoral process. We have a bilingual hotline, Ve Vota, where callers can get fundamental basic information on voting practices and procedures. We also do our own direct targeted voter engagement, and we very much incorporate our own research findings as well as the findings of groups like the Center for Inclusive Democracy. So I think this question of whether this snapshot of 2020 is going to be what we're going to see for the future in California raises some really good questions. It does seem that if you build the infrastructure for a lot of options for vote by mail, you send people vote by mail ballots, you make sure there's lots of places they can drop it off, you make sure they can drop it off early, right? And you have a pandemic, you do this in the environment of a pandemic, yes, you will see an increase in vote by mail through all sorts of different means, okay? I think another thing to note is that California worked to say, hey, you know what, if we're gonna be really wanting voters to feel that they can vote safely, right, we need to conduct public information. And there was a relatively robust campaign by the Secretary of State to educate people about voting safely and the different options, right? So I think there's some things we'll be looking at for the recall. One is, what will the public health environment be, right? Are people going to feel the same impetus to, vote by mail? Or are they going to feel in any way, shape, or form more secure in terms of in-person voting, and what is the Delta variant going? How is that going to play? But I think also this importance of having robust voter education. I think if we are going to see vote by mail, if we're going to become more like Colorado, that will only occur if we not only have this much widespread accessibility of getting ballots mailed, having a lot of different ways and times you can drop them off, but also having that robust voter education. So I think those are all things we could be looking at for the future in getting a sense of whether, like I said, we're seeing a snapshot in a particular moment of time, and also whether we want to use what we learned from the pandemic to make certain reforms and changes sort of a permanent component of our policy and election landscape.
Thank you very much. Okay, next question. This is for Rosalind, so I'll let you continue with us. The survey data provides insight into where voters receive their general election information and why they chose their voting method and location. So how can or should these findings inform voter outreach efforts aimed at Latinos and other underrepresented groups?
Great. Well, thank you again. So I think the findings really have some very serious implications for how do we reach and engage Latino voters and other underrepresented voters or voters of color. And I want to start with the finding that certain groups of voters tended to vote in person more than others. And these are Latino voters, I believe it was youth, new voters. One of the things these voters have in common is that many of them are not yet fully familiar with the electoral process. They're new to the electoral process, right? And so there may be a sense that you can get some information, you can get assistance you need, that if you're new to something and it's unfamiliar to you, you want to vote in person. The implications for outreach are that, we need to still make sure that voter engagement and education emphasizes the full range of options. I think all of the data, not just for Latinos and other underrepresented groups, but all of the data show that Californians want to really choose from a lot of different ways to vote. So when outreach is done and education is done, we have to make sure we give good attention to the different ways and say, hey, there's a lot of different ways you can vote in California, and that people know about them. I think the second set of really significant findings were on the ballot rejection rates and the signature issues. And I think these indicate that for Latinos, and again, other voters who are not yet familiar with the process, right, voter education has to be very specific about how do you complete your vote by mail materials and complete them correctly. Whether the issue was that you didn't put a signature on, whether from other I believe there are other groups where the ballots came in too late. Whatever those issues are, you really need to have focused education on the specifics of how do you complete and properly turn in your vote by mail ballot. I do think a finding that bears more looking into is the matching issue. I'm not sure, I think we need to learn a little bit more about what's going on with respect to the lack of signature matching. And then I think also the information and implications about the different places that voters get information is very important. First, as a starting point, the fact that many voters were not aware that there were changes. Many Latino and other underrepresented voters weren't aware that there were going to be changes in this election. But just as important is, first of all, how did people get information? And I think anyone who does outreach, whether it's an election officials, whether it's a nonprofit organization, whoever it is doing outreach, has to realize that you have to target and tailor your outreach methods to your audience. We saw the high prevalence of social media and family and friends among Latinos as a way to reach Latinos and some of the other groups, but there were traditional media, there were other approaches. So you have to have a lot of different approaches. There's no one size fits all for outreach. And then same with the information about where your voting site locations are. Again, different groups got information in different ways. Where there was the information guide, the vote by mail package, other sources, the website. So you need to tailor that for your audience and take into account the diversity of the audience reach. And then for the future of elections, I think this finding that people are saying for the future, some kind of voting in person, whether it's early voting or same date, we really want to see how that's going to see what that means. I'd like us to unpack that more as you do future research. And then just finally, I want to just concur with comments that Jonathan made about, the diversity of our electorate. We have to do all these things in our outreach and our education, and we have to also make sure that language accessibility and accessibility for persons with disabilities is baked in to all of the outreach work we do. So we have an exciting challenge ahead, and we look forward to working with election officials and policymakers and other people to continue to develop and implement effective voter education and outreach.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. And I should note too that last piece of data that you mentioned in terms of the desire for in-person voting going forward, just to note that is of eligible voters, so including those that didn't vote in 2020. And I think that's an important distinction to make as well for if I didn't make it earlier. Thank you. All right, next question. This is our last question of our panel, and this goes to Jonathan. Now let's talk policy. So what are implications from the research findings with regard to future election policy in California?
Several thoughts immediately come to mind. The first is that county voting materials are critically important, and we should be investing in them, perhaps to a greater degree than we do currently. Your report, Mindy, shows that when determining where to vote, for example, voters cited their top 3 information sources were all provided by their county elections office. And that underscores and echoes research we did with the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside last summer, where we did focus groups in 8 languages. And what we found was that limited English-speaking voters, and particularly elders in those communities, when searching for good, reliable information, the place they trust most is from their actual county elections office, more so than social media or influencers or anything like that, which means that we need to really nail plain language, user-centered design, and language access in all of those county materials and sources. And I don't think we do that yet. And frankly, it's not the fault of elections officials, in my opinion. They have a million things to focus on, and civic design is one of thousands. And frankly, it's not necessarily their expertise. And I think even county elections officials would acknowledge that that's not the thing that comes up first when they describe their job necessarily. I think we should be equipping them with consulting experts on those topics, or with full-time staff with expertise in those topics, like a plain language and user design ombudsman in every county, for example, something of that kind, or bilingual staff that speak all relevant languages for a county. And that would require the state to up its funding for our county elections offices to really invest in those materials that voters rely on. Another question for me is what is the secret sauce of the VCA, and specifically of drop boxes, right? So voting by drop box was the most used method throughout the state in the 2020 general. VCA counties had a higher use of drop box than counties that had not adopted the VCA. And so the question for me is that because VCA counties tend to have more drop boxes, or is it because there's way more voter education about voting options in VCA counties, and thus voters are introduced to drop boxes through information sources that they trust? Is it possible that that voter education and outreach is actually shifting voter behavior, right? And we also know that the VCA counties, at least in 2018, had higher turnout than non-VCA counties. So we need to determine, I think, through future research and inquiry, if that higher turnout in VCA counties is because of, one, there's more voting options and more flexible voting system, whether it's two, that there's more voter education and outreach in VCA counties because of the VCA's requirements, or if three, it's some other variable. It's just inherent in the counties that tend to select for the VCA that they have higher turnout and there's some sort of systemic bias in the data. And if the answer is that more voter education and outreach by elections offices is actually shifting voter behavior and increasing voter turnout in these VCA counties, then we should be requiring it and funding it everywhere. And I think there's more research and there's more inquiry that's required on that. Another thought is that I don't think we should start policymaking in dramatic ways around the popularity of the mail ballot and the findings you have here, Mindy. I mean, as Rosalind noted, when asked about future elections, huge portions of the eligible voter sample said that they plan to vote in person in the future, right? People aren't willing to give up their in-person option. And more importantly, just under 10% of the voters sampled in immigrant communities said that they want to use language assistance at an in-person site in the future. Just under 10% of people in the sample said they need disability assistance at an in-person site in the future. Just over 10% said that they would like to use an in-person site to register to vote in the future. And there might be some overlap between all those different categories, but we're talking about potentially up to 30% of the population that says they need critical in-person assistance when voting. And that 30% includes some of our most marginalized and most vulnerable voters, right? Limited English speakers, voters with disabilities, voters displaced by emergencies, highly transient voters, et cetera. And your data shows, Mindy, that new voters tend to vote in person at higher rates. So my conclusion from all of that is that if we're working to build an inclusive and equitable democracy that reaches those voters I just mentioned, we have to retain accessible in-person voting options, and we can't start legislating around the huge popularity of the vote by mail ballot. And just the last thought for me, Mindy, which is that, with Tahoe thank you for starting today with an acknowledgement of what's happening in South Lake Tahoe, and with Tahoe on our minds. It feels like voting amid catastrophe is now a standard part of life in California, whether it's a pandemic or wildfires or some other climate-related catastrophe or emergency, and creating the most flexible voting system possible for our California voters feels like it's essential. And the Voters' Choice Act does that in myriad ways, right? If you've been displaced by a fire, you can vote anywhere in your county. You can re-register because of same-day voter registration. You can re-register on election day at your new address, and so on and so forth. And just when I'm thinking about policy, I'm newly attuned in the last few years to making our voting system resilient to climate emergency.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And on that note, my understanding is, as the city of South Lake Tahoe is evacuated right now, it's essentially a halt, right? People cannot vote in person, and I believe they're being asked to mail in their ballots. But during a crisis, the difficulty of that is obviously evident. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out with a few questions. We've got some questions in the chat. Before I do, I just again want to thank Katie and her team at USC Price for putting on the webinar and managing it so fantastically as always. And again, my team, speaking of this wonderful research, again, their hard work that they have put into bringing this about. So thank you, everyone. So it looks like we've got just a few questions here. So I'm just going to take them. I don't see anything specific for Rosalind and Jonathan, although one might pop up. So I'll take them in order. So first question, did the choice of voting in person in the future include dropping off a vote by mail ballot at a voting location? I assume you're referring to the options on the survey. Yes, that was one of the options. And people did register that as a choice or a preference. Next question, it would be great to hear what you know about young voters in California in 2020. So I didn't present because of time today, but in the report, everything we look at, the voter file analysis, the surveys, all broken out by age groups, including youth age 18 to 24. So that's there for you. I think I touched on it here, but I did not actually show data. The data charts are in the report in depth. Then there is a question about, and I'll summarize, acknowledging that there are lots of differences across the state in terms of what a drop box, not just their location and number, but it looks like, what a drop box is, how you define a drop box, whether it's in a library, whether it's a physical drop box outside, and asking, or suggesting that future research would be helpful to understand the differences across drop boxes. More research into wider and safer use of drop boxes might be important. So thank you. And then what outreach efforts have been most successful at reaching students of color in four-year community colleges? And I think that's the last question. Then what can we expect in BCA expansion in 2022? In 1 minute, does somebody want to, I hate to put you on the spot, but anything you'd want to say about the question regarding what outreach efforts have been most successful reaching students of color in four-year community colleges? Any thoughts there as we close?
Yeah, I would just like to say that there has been a lot of work to incorporate voter registration and voter engagement into sort of the day-to-day activities of what community college students experience. So, for example, when you're signing up for classes, can you be encouraged to also do online voter registration, right? When you get information about your curriculum, if if there's elections that are going on, can information be provided? I think incorporating that into what the community college does is helpful, but I also think knowing what are the messages that resonate with college students. You need to think about, educating college students about, voting affects the cost of living and the rent you're going to have to pay. Voting affects your tuition or what might happen to your college debts, right? Making very personalized messages that focus on issues that specifically relate to youth and students, I think is an important part of voter engagement of college students as well.
Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you for taking on the challenge of less than a minute to answer that. Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you to everyone that joined us, either through Zoom, or we also, of course, we're broadcasting live on Facebook. That'll be available on the USC Price Facebook page, as well as the Center for Inclusive Democracies page. Thank you, Rosalind Gold, very much, and Jonathan Methestein, very much for your wonderful insights and for your voices that you brought today. We will see you again at a future webinar, I am sure. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day and take care.